The morning erupted in chaos as fire alarms shrieked, and red lights flooded the CEO's glass office. Richard Hale said, "What the hell just happened?" His voice cracked as screens filled with breaking news and collapsing numbers. Board members rushed through hallways, phones pressed to ears, panic radiating with every step. The company logo flickered on the giant wall display before dissolving into headlines screaming scandal. Elizabeth Moore said, "Richard, they've leaked everything. Emails, contracts, the deals we buried." Richard staggered back, sweat gathering on his temple as sirens outside merged with the storm inside. His empire was crumbling in seconds, every betrayal detonating like a bomb. Colleagues whispered accusations, cameras turned toward his failures, and the weight of ambition pressed against his chest like iron. Richard whispered, "This can't be happening now," but the truth was undeniable. In one violent moment, trust evaporated, and silence became more damning than sound. The building trembled with noise as security stormed into the upper floors. Richard Hale said, "Seal every channel. Lock down our systems before we bleed out further." Elizabeth Moore followed with urgency. "Richard, the leaks are global. It's not contained anymore." Richard's phone vibrated non-stop, each alert another cut to his empire. Board members screamed into calls, arguing over stock losses. Richard stood still for a moment, lost in the tide of voices, then snapped, "Everyone out, now!" The room emptied, but suspicion lingered in every look. A storm rolled heavy against the windows, lightning flashing as if mocking his collapse. Richard sank into his chair, rubbing his temples, the sound of sirens outside matching the chaos inside. He whispered, "This is how empires fall, not with silence but with fire and noise." Richard Hale paced the office, rage bubbling beneath his fear. He shouted, "Find out who did this. I want names tonight." Elizabeth Moore said softly, "It's too clean, Richard. This was planned for months." He stopped mid-stride, his shadow fractured by the blinking red alarms. Outside, news helicopters hovered like vultures, beams of light slashing the storm. His phone buzzed again, this time a private message. "They're inside." Richard froze, eyes narrowing. He muttered, "Inside? That means betrayal." Elizabeth clenched her jaw, her silence more powerful than words. The weight of suspicion pressed between them as thunder cracked overhead. The boardroom filled with murmurs as executives debated behind closed doors. Richard Hale said, "You think you can strip me of control? Not after what I built." A silver-haired director countered coldly, "What you built is collapsing because of your arrogance." The words hit like a blade, silence cutting the air. Elizabeth Moore stepped in. "This is not the time for blame. We need strategy." Yet whispers multiplied. Alliances shifted like shadows in candlelight. Richard felt walls closing in, trust fracturing faster than glass under pressure. He knew now the battle was not only outside but inside, and it had already begun. Night descended heavy over the city as Richard stood alone in his office. The skyline pulsed with lightning, echoing the chaos inside. He muttered, "They want my empire, they'll have to tear it from my hands." Elizabeth Moore returned quietly, saying, "Richard, some of them already have." Her words cut deeper than the storm, truth slipping past his defenses. He gripped a window frame, rain streaking down like veins of despair. Behind him, the news wall played endless loops of his downfall, the world watching his empire's destruction. Richard whispered to the glass, "I will not be erased." The storm outside deepened as Richard Hale shouted into the boardroom, "We must contain the bleeding before the market opens tomorrow." His voice shook but carried steel. Elizabeth Moore said, "Richard, containment is impossible. We're fighting ghosts." Executives argued like jackals over a carcass, each voice rising in panic. Richard slammed his fist against the table, the sound silencing the room. He said, "You will obey me until my last breath, or you will join my enemies." A younger director muttered, "You already lost control." Elizabeth's eyes shifted nervously, sensing the divide widening. Phones buzzed constantly, screens flashing collapsing numbers, and outside lightning painted the skyline like cracks in glass. Richard leaned forward, eyes blazing, whispering, almost to himself, "I built this empire from ash once. I can rebuild it again." The tension hung thick, alliances fraying with every heartbeat. The crisis room glowed under sterile white lights as Richard Hale barked orders to his security chief. He said, "Trace the leaks, shut down every channel they're using." The chief replied firmly, "Sir, they're coming from inside our networks." Richard's face froze, and Elizabeth whispered, "That means someone close." Suspicion burned in his eyes as he scanned the faces in the room. Phones rang endlessly, each tone an alarm. A map of the company's servers glowed on the wall, flashing red with breaches. Richard whispered to himself, "They want me buried, but they'll taste my fire first." Elizabeth placed a hand on the table, her voice firm. "Then we start by locking down our house." The team shifted uneasily, the air thick with paranoia. Richard Hale stormed into his private office, slamming the door. He growled, "There's a traitor here, and I'll burn the walls down to find them." Elizabeth Moore entered cautiously, whispering, "If you accuse the wrong person, you'll finish the job for them." Richard's hands trembled as he poured whiskey, his reflection fractured in the glass. Helicopters buzzed outside, cameras flashing like vultures circling the carcass. He muttered, "They'll paint me as a monster, Elizabeth, but I will not fall to shadows." She answered coldly, "Then you better decide fast who you trust, because your empire is already divided." Richard's rage gave way to exhaustion, his voice breaking. "I trusted them all, and that's the mistake that will kill me." The trading floor exploded with panic as news reports streamed across giant monitors. Brokers screamed into phones, numbers crashing in real time. Richard Hale stood above them on the mezzanine, his voice booming, "Do not surrender, fight every trade." Yet his words drowned beneath chaos. Elizabeth Moore shouted beside him, "Richard, they're selling us apart piece by piece." His jaw clenched as he watched graphs bleed red. Traders cursed, faces drenched in sweat, their empire collapsing dollar by dollar. He gripped the railing, whispering through clenched teeth, "They will not see me break." But inside he felt his soul fracturing like the stocks plummeting beneath his eyes. Night pressed deeper as Richard sat in a dimly lit corner office, silence heavier than the storm outside. He whispered, "I can't hold this empire alone." Elizabeth Moore answered softly, "Then stop pretending you ever could." Her words struck like lightning, raw and cutting. Richard's eyes glistened, whiskey glass shaking in his grip. A phone buzzed with another headline, "Hostile takeover imminent." He muttered, "They circle like wolves, and I stand here bleeding." Elizabeth looked at him with both pity and steel. "Then you either bare your teeth or get devoured." Richard stared into the storm, the battle raging louder inside than out, whispering, "I will bare my teeth." The storm raged as Richard Hale paced his office, muttering, "They want me blind, but I see the knife waiting." Elizabeth Moore entered swiftly, saying, "Richard, you need to hear this. Our CFO's movements don't add up." Richard froze, his jaw tightening like stone. He said, "Daniel Reed has been my ally for 20 years. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. Allies don't vanish into closed-door meetings with rivals. Lightning cracked, casting fractured shadows across Richard's face. His phone buzzed with another encrypted message. "Trust no one." His breath quickened, suspicion eating at him. He whispered, "If Daniel's gone against me, then the betrayal comes from the very heart of this empire." Elizabeth's voice shook. "This could destroy everything if we're wrong." Richard clenched his fists, rage rising. "I'd rather kill the ghost than be murdered by it." Richard Hale confronted Daniel Reed in a private boardroom, his voice sharp. "Where were you tonight?" Daniel, calm but cold, replied, "Managing the chaos you created." Richard's fists tightened on the polished table. He hissed, "Don't lie to me. I know about your meetings with Callahan." Daniel smirked faintly. "Perhaps I'm ensuring survival, Richard, since you've lost control." Elizabeth Moore stepped forward, warning, "Careful, Daniel. Betrayal carries a heavy cost. Daniel's smile faded, eyes hardening, and loyalty carries a heavier one when the ship is sinking. Richard's voice trembled with fury. If you've betrayed me, you'll regret the day you joined this company. Silence clung to the room, thick with suspicion and unspoken war. Later, Elizabeth cornered Richard in the hallway, whispering, "He's hiding something, I can feel it." Richard's face was pale, drained by the weight of betrayal. He muttered, "Daniel was my shield, my right hand. If he's gone, I am exposed." Elizabeth pressed firmly, "Then treat him as the enemy until you prove otherwise." Richard turned toward the glass wall, staring at the city storm. Enemies outside, enemies inside. I can't tell the difference anymore. Helicopter lights swept across the building like searchlights on prey. He whispered to himself, "Trust is already dead. All that remains is survival." Elizabeth said sharply, "Then survive, Richard, before he buries you alive." His silence carried more fear than words. In a secret basement garage, Richard Hale met a shadowy figure, breath visible in the damp cold. The man whispered, "Your empire has cracks. Daniel feeds information directly to Callahan." Richard's voice was gravel, "Name your price for proof." The figure handed over a flash drive, muttering, "Proof costs blood, not money." Elizabeth Moore waited by the car, scanning shadows nervously. Richard gripped the drive like a blade, muttering, "If this is true, Daniel Reed has already signed his death warrant." The figure vanished into darkness, leaving Richard shaking with rage and paranoia. Elizabeth said, "This changes everything." Richard replied coldly, "No, it only confirms what I already knew. The betrayal is real." Thunder roared above as if sealing the verdict. Richard Hale stormed back into his office, slamming the flash drive onto the desk. He shouted, "He betrayed me. Daniel Reed is the knife in my back." Elizabeth Moore's face tightened. "Then the war has already begun inside our walls." Richard collapsed into his chair, rage flooding into exhaustion. His voice cracked, "I gave him everything: trust, loyalty, power." Elizabeth whispered, "And he used it to bury you." Richard's fists slammed the armrests, his whisper colder than the storm, "Then I will strip him down to ashes." The news wall flickered with Daniel's image shaking hands with Callahan. Richard's eyes burned. He chose his side. Now he will face mine. The storm outside pounded in rhythm with his fury, the city trembling under his wrath. The courtroom like boardroom erupted as Richard Hale thundered, "You think you can strip me of my throne? Not while I breathe." Thomas Callahan sneered, "You've already bled your empire dry." Elizabeth Moore shouted, "This meeting is sabotage, not governance." Papers flew as executives argued, their voices colliding like crashing waves. Daniel Reed sat calm, his silence heavier than any word. Richard's eyes pierced him, whispering with venom, "Judas walks among us." Lightning outside cracked as if punctuating his fury. Callahan smirked, "Your allies crumble, Richard, one by one." Richard slammed both palms on the table, growling, "Let the walls fall. I'll still be standing when the ashes clear." The room trembled with the weight of war, lines of loyalty shattered like glass. On the trading floor, chaos boiled as hostile bids poured in. Richard Hale stood above the frenzy, shouting, "Buy everything you can. We hold the line here." Elizabeth Moore leaned in, whispering, "Callahan's people are rigging the trades. We're drowning in sabotage." Phones rang like alarms, brokers screamed into headsets, and monitors glowed blood red. Richard's hand gripped the railing so hard his knuckles whitened. He muttered, "They think I'll surrender. They don't know me." A young broker shouted, "Sir, we're losing billions by the minute." Richard snarled, "Then we lose fighting, not crawling." The floor shook with frenzy, voices blending into thunder. Elizabeth said, "Richard, if we don't pull out now, they'll bury us alive." His silence was louder than any roar. In a shadowed office, the disillusioned employee, Sarah Kent, confronted Richard Hale. She said, "People are suffering while you fight to protect your crown." Richard snapped, "This company is my life's work. It will not fall to thieves. Sarah's eyes burned. Your workers are drowning while you chase pride. Elizabeth Moore intervened. Sarah, this isn't the time. But Sarah stepped closer, voice sharp. It's always been the time. You just never listened. Richard's anger faltered, his voice trembling. Do you think I wanted this storm? Sarah whispered coldly. It doesn't matter what you wanted, it matters who pays the price. Silence fell heavy as Richard turned away, his reflection fractured in the storm glass. His empire wasn't just collapsing in numbers, it was collapsing in hearts. Richard Hale met the disillusioned mentor, Charles Grant, in a private library smelling of dust and leather. Charles, voice heavy with age, said, I once thought I was untouchable too. Richard muttered, and you fell. Charles, eyes sharp, whispered, ambition is fire, Richard. It warms until it burns you alive. Richard paced, hands trembling. I can't stop now, not when wolves tear at my walls. Charles replied, then you'll end where I did. Alone, dethroned, a name whispered only in caution. Lightning lit the old man's face, wrinkles etched like scars of war. Richard stared at him with rage and despair, whispering, I am not you. Charles smirked bitterly. That's what I said once too. The silence afterward screamed louder than thunder. The underdog rose quietly amid the chaos. Michael Torres, a young strategist, spoke up in the boardroom. We can fight smarter, not louder. Richard Hale snapped. Stay out of this, boy. Michael stood tall, voice firm. While you scream, they win. Let me show you a way. Elizabeth Moore glanced sharply, sensing his courage. Callahan smirked from across the table. Ah, the puppy speaks. Michael retorted, better a puppy with teeth than a wolf blinded by arrogance. Gasps filled the room as Richard stared at him, torn between fury and grudging respect. Michael whispered, you can't save this empire with fire. Let me save it with strategy. For the first time, Richard hesitated, doubt creeping into his storm. The boardroom was suffocating as Richard Hale shouted, Daniel Reed, you sit here as if nothing has happened while you've been feeding our rival. Daniel smirked faintly. I fed him nothing you didn't hand me first. Elizabeth Moore gasped, you sold us out, Daniel. Thunder boomed outside, drowning the murmurs of stunned executives. Richard's voice shook. I gave you trust, and you broke it like glass. Daniel leaned forward, whispering, trust is the currency of fools. I chose survival. Richard slammed his fist on the table, his face red with fury. Elizabeth hissed, you'll burn for this betrayal. Daniel calmly replied, the fire's already here, and Richard lit it himself. Silence fell as the weight of treachery pressed on the room like a noose. Richard stumbled into his office, hands trembling as he replayed Daniel's words. Elizabeth followed, whispering, Richard, he's been Callahan's weapon all along. Richard growled, and I sharpened the blade for him. The news wall blazed with footage of Daniel and Callahan shaking hands. The Empire's downfall broadcast across every channel. Richard muttered, they've already declared me dead. Elizabeth gripped his arm, saying, then prove them wrong, fight with what you have left. Richard's shoulders sagged, the storm rattling the glass like a war drum. He whispered, I trusted the wrong man, and now the Empire's veins are bleeding out. Elizabeth answered, then cut off the infection before it kills what remains. His eyes burned again with a flicker of fire. Richard stormed into the trading floor, his voice echoing above the chaos. Pull every asset, cut Daniel out completely. Brokers hesitated, fear written on every face. Michael Torres spoke up, Richard, the damage is already irreversible if you keep reacting with rage. Richard snapped, I don't take orders from you. Michael met his eyes, voice calm but firm, then you'll lose more than your crown, you'll lose what's left of the Empire. Elizabeth said, Richard, listen, he's right. Strategy, not fury, is our only chance. Richard froze, torn between anger and the sting of truth. He whispered, if we play his game, then Daniel wins. Michael replied sharply, then rewrite the game. For the first time, Richard's defiance softened into desperate resolve. In the shadow of the storm, Richard confronted Daniel privately. His voice cracked with rage. You chose Callahan over me, over everything we built. Daniel's eyes gleamed cold. I chose the side that wins. Richard lunged, grabbing Daniel by the lapels, growling. Then you chose your grave. Daniel whispered with a cruel smile. You're already buried, Richard. You just don't see it yet. Elizabeth burst in, shouting, Stop this madness before it destroys what's left. Richard shoved Daniel back, his breath ragged, eyes burning with betrayal and desperation. Daniel straightened his suit, voice dripping poison. This is only the beginning. Richard whispered, No, this is the reckoning. The storm howled outside as the war lines deepened. The storm reached its peak as Richard sat in silence, staring at the burning glow of collapsing stock reports. Elizabeth said quietly, The walls are falling faster than we can rebuild them. Michael Torres entered, voice steady. We can't undo betrayal, but we can redirect it. Richard muttered, Betrayal isn't redirected, it's punished. Elizabeth warned, Punishment won't save you, it will bury you. Michael leaned forward, whispering, Daniel and Callahan expect rage. Give them patience instead. Let them underestimate you. Richard's eyes flickered with a new flame, his voice low. Then we fight shadows with shadows. Elizabeth whispered, If you do this, there's no going back. Richard's whisper cut through the storm. There never was. The boardroom became a battlefield as Richard Hale thundered, You'll not take what I bled to build. Thomas Callahan smirked coldly. It's already mine, Richard. Elizabeth Moore shouted, This coup is corruption in daylight. Daniel Reed leaned back, calm as a knife. No, it's correction. Richard's hand slammed against the table, veins bulging with fury. He roared, You think I'll surrender this empire to traitors? Callahan's silver eyes glinted. Not surrender. Exile. The board erupted in chaos, voices rising into a storm of betrayal. Elizabeth's voice pierced through. Richard, if you don't fight now, you lose everything. Richard's chest heaved, storm outside flashing like cannon fire as he whispered, Then let the war end tonight. The votes were called, the screens glowing red and green like execution lights. Richard Hale gripped the edge of the table, whispering, They'll strip me alive. Elizabeth Moore muttered, Not if we hold the line. Thomas Callahan leaned forward, smiling, This is democracy, Richard. Your empire has no place in it anymore. Daniel Reed's voice cut through, The numbers don't lie. Your reign ends tonight. Richard's face paled, rage trembling into desperation. He said, I carried every one of you to this table. You'll betray me now? Silence followed, heavy as stone, before the first vote turned against him. Elizabeth squeezed his arm, whispering, They can take your title, but not your fire. Richard whispered back, Then I'll burn the title down with me. Richard stormed from the boardroom into the glass hallway, his reflection splintered in storm-lit panels. He growled, They'll not erase me with a vote. Elizabeth followed, saying, Richard, the battle is lost in numbers, but not in will. His fists trembled as he muttered, Daniel thinks he's the heir, but he's the executioner. Elizabeth countered, then used his arrogance against him. Richard turned sharply, eyes burning with fury. Callahan won tonight's stage. Tomorrow, I bury him. Helicopters hovered outside, their beams sweeping across the glass like vultures. Elizabeth whispered, Then prepare, because the cost will be everything. Richard's voice cracked into resolve, Then I pay in blood if I must. In the shadows of the underground garage, Richard met with Michael Torres. Richard whispered, The board thinks me finished. Michael replied, Then let them think so, while we strike unseen. Richard's eyes narrowed. Callahan and Daniel already believe they've won. Michael leaned forward. That's when pride blinds them. We set the trap tonight. Elizabeth arrived, her voice sharp. You're playing with knives in the dark. Michael countered, That's the only way to cut men like Callahan. Richard's breath trembled as he whispered, Then sharpen the blades, because war doesn't end with a vote. It ends with blood. The storm above groaned like a beast as shadows thickened around them. The climax thundered as Richard returned to the boardroom, eyes ablaze. He shouted, Strip my crown, but you cannot strip my fire. Callahan smirked. Fire consumes only the fool who lights it. Daniel Reed sneered. You've already lost. Richard's voice cracked into steel. No, I've only begun. Elizabeth's hand touched his shoulder, whispering, choose carefully. This is the last move. Richard raised his head, storm reflecting in his eyes. Then let my last move be war. Gasps erupted as he hurled documents across the table, scattering proof of Callahan's sabotage. The room shook with thunder as betrayal turned back on the betrayers. Callahan's smirk faded into rage. Daniel's face cracked into shock. Richard roared, the Empire bleeds, but not by my hand, by yours. The boardroom was silent after Richard Hale's thunderous reveal, the storm outside echoing his fury. Callahan seethed. You think paper saves you? Richard growled. No, truth saves me, and buries you. Elizabeth Moore said firmly. The evidence is undeniable. Daniel Reed's face cracked, his voice shaking. You set me up. Richard leaned closer, whispering, no, you set yourself up by thinking I was blind. Gasps echoed as betrayal turned inward. Callahan slammed a fist. This empire will choke under your weakness. Richard replied coldly, better weakness than rot. Lightning flashed as silence swallowed the room. Every face turned pale under the weight of revelation. Richard Hale staggered into his office, body trembling from exhaustion. Elizabeth Moore followed, whispering, you won tonight, but at what cost? Richard sank into his chair, whispering, I may have burned them, but I burned myself too. The city storm reflected in the glass like veins of lightning across his face. Michael Torres entered, quiet but resolute. You turned the tide, Richard, but the Empire bleeds still. Richard muttered, empires can bleed, but kings can't falter. Elizabeth's eyes softened. You're no king now. You're a man carrying fire in his bare hands. His hands shook as he stared at them, whispering, and fire always consumes the one who carries it. The silence was heavier than thunder. The trading floor was eerily quiet as brokers watched screens bleed red. Richard stood above them, whispering to himself, they see me as a ghost now. Elizabeth said softly, you still have fire left, Richard. Michael Torres countered, or you could step aside and let the next fight begin. Richard's eyes narrowed, his voice trembling. Step aside and watch them carve my empire into pieces? Never. He gripped the railing, knuckles white, muttering, I built this empire with blood. I'll not watch it die with silence. Elizabeth whispered, then you fight knowing victory might never come. His jaw tightened, storm light flickering across his weary face. He whispered, I'll fight anyway. In the quiet library, Charles Grant sat with Richard Hale, both men surrounded by shadows of ambition. Charles whispered, I told you ambition burns its bearer. Richard muttered, and yet I still breathe. Charles smirked bitterly. For now. Elizabeth Moore stood at the doorway, her voice sharp. Richard isn't finished. Richard looked at her, voice low. No, but I am broken. Michael Torres said, broken steel still cuts, if sharpened. Richard leaned back, eyes heavy, whispering, then sharpen me, but know the blade may turn on its wielder. Charles chuckled darkly, spoken like every king before his fall. Lightning crashed, drowning his final words in echo. The storm faded into silence as Richard Hale stood alone in his office. He whispered to the empty glass, empires don't die, they haunt. The city below glowed faintly, broken, but alive. Elizabeth's voice echoed faintly in his memory, you're not a king anymore. Michael's words followed, then fight like a man, not a throne. Richard's reflection stared back at him, fractured by raindrops. He whispered, the fire is mine, even if it consumes me. He placed his hand on the glass as thunder rolled far away. His silhouette looked like a ghost against the skyline. His voice dropped into silence. They may bury the empire, but they'll never bury me. The room echoed with haunting stillness, the final note of defiance.